Welcome back everyone. In today's lesson, we're going to cover how to use knights. The knights are the trickiest pieces on the chessboard, so mastering how to use them will help you skyrocket your chess ability. We're going to cover this in three parts: how to use knights in the opening, middle game, and endgame, because they're all completely different. And as always, this video is packed with practical examples so we can cover a whole bunch of situations and you can apply them to your games. Last but not least, my name is Philip and I make these videos to help you improve at chess. I'm a 2100 FIDE rated player from New Zealand, and if you like this content, please consider subscribing, and I'll see you in the next videos as well. Okay, so the opening. Two principles, two rules of thumb that I absolutely love that will hold you in great stead are: get your knights out before any other piece. The reason is, you know where your knights are most likely going to go, but you don't know where your bishops are going to go. Your bishop might want to come to, let's say it's white. Okay, let's go c6, e6. White's bishop might want to come to e3 or d3, or might want to recapture the pawn on c4. Likewise, black isn't sure where they want the bishop on e7 or d6, whether this one is coming to b7 or possibly down this diagonal if the e6 pawn gets traded off. But you do know, and this goes to principle number 2, that your knights are most effective on the optimal squares of f3, f6, and c3 and d7. So these four squares, keep them in mind. Almost every opening, they're the strongest squares for the knights. And if not, knight b to d7 here, then knight to c6, and likewise for white, instead of the queenside knight coming to c3, d2 is also an option. So 9 times out of 10, if you put your knights on these squares, you cannot go wrong out of the opening. And 9 times out of 10, if you move your knights out, you develop your knights before your other pieces, you maintain flexibility out of the opening, so you can decide where to move your queen, your bishop, all that kind of stuff later, once you know where, once your opponent has played their hand, once you know how they're going to set up, you can set up accordingly. Those are the two principles for the opening. So let's go into the middle game. So the middle game, first set of principles is, this is going to be consistent. These 6 squares are your strongest squares for your knights in the middle game, because these are the squares where they can influence the game the most. And now let's see how we can practically apply that. Here we go. Here's a knight on e4. This is a pretty influential, effective knight. And this leads to our principle number 2, which is what from there. So as the game develops, we're pushing our pieces further and further forward. Like here's an example. Knight to e4, we want to move the knight to d6, or maybe to g5. That's how influential that knight is. This knight on d7, it's still not really playing a very big part in the game. It's purely defensive, really. It might jump to f8 or f6 maybe if f6 is played. But apart from that, it can only best trade itself off for white's knight. So white is going to try and use the advantage that they've got a strong knight, whereas their opponent has a weak knight, by playing something like bishop to g5. And after these pieces are traded, we can see this comes back to another principle of the middle game, looking for outposts for the knights. In this case, an outpost is a square, usually, where no opponent pawn can kick your knight out from that square. So here, the pawns are on c6 and d6, which creates this hole or outpost for the knight on d6, and white is just going to drop that knight in here. And again, you can kind of see how from being on one of these central squares, the knight has found itself on a much more established square subsequently, and now it's really controlling the game. If black was to try to dislodge the knight, because that's a protected outpost, that's a really strong outpost for the knight, the game could continue like this. White gets his rook out, and now black has traded off that passive knight. But what kind of position has black ended up with? He's just got a bishop, that really can never contest this knight because this is on a dark square. And a weakness here, and punchline is white has a strategic victory already in this game. And if this is how quickly black's position can fall apart. Let's say black just plays a normal looking move like rook to d8. White simply plays knight to f5, making the most of this pin black cannot take, threatening checkmate here and threatening the rook here and the queen. So if the queen moves, because the queen's under attack, where is the queen going to go? Let's say the queen goes to f6, but we simply go check, and if the queen takes back, we go checkmate. Okay, so one more situation. We'll go back on this one. How are outposts created? So this is a stripped back position. Imagine there's more pieces on the board, but another common set of outposts are, if black plays e5, white now has access to the f5 and d5 squares. And this happens in so many games, so you want to remember this one. But likewise, let's say white goes here, and assume black has something that's defending this pawn. Black might play knight to e6, trying to jump into these squares themselves. But after something like this, black's knight gets kicked out because there's a pawn that can kick the knight from this outpost. But then later in the game, black's going to want to make the most of that outpost for themselves. So this is where both knights try to play for outposts and just maximizing their knight squares. Okay, cool. So now let's move into endgames. So endgames are a whole nother kettle of fish. There are a couple of rules of thumb. Let's go. First one is, if you get into an endgame where your opponent has a bishop and you have a knight, you want to make sure you trade down into that endgame only really if all the pawns are on one side of the board. Because bishops are long-range pieces, in this case, still a theoretical draw, but black's bishop, just to illustrate the point, black's bishop can both support his pawn getting moving forward, and if it comes to the right diagonal, let's say if the bishop gets to this diagonal, it can support its own pawn and stop white's pawn at the same time. Whereas white with the knight can only slowly maneuver around the board from one side to the other. And so it's a very slow piece in endgames. So it only really is effective because it covers both color complexes. It's only effective, or most effective, when all the pawns and all the players on one side of the board. So just to give you another example, here's a few more pawns on the board. If white was a pawn up, white would technically still be winning, but it would be quite hard to convert this with a knight. Whereas if black was a pawn up, black would have a much easier job because, again, black's bishop influences both sides of the board where there's pawns. This is another unique attribute of knights, which is in endgames, you want to look for forks all the time. So here it's white to play, just as an illustration of how tricky knights are in endgames. You think white's going to make a queen, black's knight is way too far, or is it? Because if white makes a queen here, black wins the game by forking, taking the queen and making a queen of their own. So instead of making a queen, white is going to sidestep and protect the f6 square, but that allows black to continue moving the pawn, and suddenly after queen h7, let's say king here, queen takes the knight, we just get into an equal endgame. So black was essentially saved, even though his knight was on the opposite side of the board. Black was saved by the ability to do a knight fork. So knight forks are crucial. Here's a fun one. This is actually something that's happened to me in a game, and it scarred me for life. I just want to pass it on to you guys. So let's say this is black to move. You know, you think black can just make a queen here and simply win the game. This is huge material advantage. But white has this tricky move here, knight f6. If the king moves to h8, rook h7 is checkmate. And if the king moves to the other side, the knight moves to h7, and if the king attacks the rook, knight f6 again. And black's king is stuck in perpetual check. That's how tricky the knights can be. One more example for the endgame. This is equal material, but this is an illustration of how important it is to have your knight close to the opponent's queening pawn. So in this case, white cannot really easily get to black's pawn because the black king defends the access of the knight, but it's white to move. So if white goes here, and you think, if black was to continue, then white would make a queen first, and black would lose the game. However, very similar to the other situation, we're going to go knight to g5, threatening the pawn. And now, once the pawn queens, we go fork, check. And once we take this, we realize that knight has no access, and we cannot stop black from making a queen. Last but not least, here's one more example, just so we finish up, showing how tricky knights are in endgames. This is an endgame with rooks on the board as well. Looks pretty balanced, but this is how dangerous the knights can be. Knight e5 check, and you think, okay, cool. We've got so many squares for the king, but hang on, do we? We can't go there. King f4 loses to a fork. King f2 loses to the same fork. King e4 loses to f5. And now if we move here, we lose the knight. And if we don't move there, we move to e3, we lose the rook. And if we move to f4, we lose the rook again. So really, the only good square is e2 or g3. So let's go g3 as an example. The game could continue with rook here, knight f2, rook here, threatening the pawn, b5, h4, king h3, only move, f5, and you can kind of see, you start thinking, man, white's actually running out of squares for that rook A. Let's say we go here, knight g6, if white isn't careful, check, king has to take, check, and the rook is taken. And so from a seemingly roughly even position, we can see how tricky that knight is. White has to look for forks everywhere in order to protect themselves in this position. So, to summarize endgames, look for forks and make sure when you're trading down, try to make sure to have a knight if the play is on one side of the board, and a bishop when there's play on both sides of the board, especially when pawns are nearly queening. Cool, so that's it for today's video lesson. I hope you guys got a lot out of that one. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing again, liking the video, sharing it, all that good stuff. It helps me know what kind of content you guys want to see more of, whether you guys got value out of the video. So any sort of feedback, any comments in the comment section, all that kind of stuff, drop them below. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video. Peace out.